violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon, and contravenes the provisions of the Security Council Resolution 1701. Since last October, the cycle of violent conflict has been repeating itself in the Middle East. Israel, since last October, total disregard for the call of the international community for an immediate ceasefire, single-mindedly advances its military operations, resulting in the protraction and expansion of the conflict. At present, an all-out war is on the verge of breaking out. At this critical juncture, any inflammatory statements and provocative actions are extremely dangerous and could easily lead to miscalculations and chain reactions, escalate the situation, or even make it completely out of control. We urge all parties, in particular Israel, to exercise restraint and refrain from any action that could lead to further escalation of the situation. President, the conflict has caused an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. As we have seen, Gaza has become an inferno on earth, while in Lebanon there has been a great deal of destruction of civilian facilities, thousands of casualties, and more than 1 million people displaced from their homes, including a large number of Palestinian refugees. We call on all parties to the conflict to respect the red lines of international humanitarian law and to protect civilians. We support the efforts of the UN humanitarian system to take urgent action to ease the humanitarian situation in Palestine and Lebanon. China reiterates the importance of respecting the neutrality of UNIFIL and of effectively ensuring the safety and security of the peacekeepers. United Nations assets and personnel should not be the target of armed attacks. President, the Security Council bears an important responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Under the current circumstances, the Council must act urgently and be united in making demands clearly and unequivocally that an immediate ceasefire must be established in Gaza. The de-escalation of the violence must be stopped, and the de-escalation of the Lebanese and Israeli situation must be advanced. The cycle of violence must be halted. Every effort must be made to prevent the spread of the fighting, and the parties concerned must be returned to the track of political and diplomatic solutions. Any rhetorics that appease and allow further military adventurism will send out wrong signals and may cause serious consequences. We hope that major countries with important influence will adopt a sincere and responsible attitude and earnestly play a more constructive role and avoid further turmoil of the situation. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. Thank you, Madam President. Allow me first and foremost to congratulate your delegation on assuming the presidency of the Council for this month, and I reiterate the full support of my country. We'd also like to thank Slovenia for the excellent presidency of the Council last month. I'd like to stress and reiterate the support of my country to the work of the Secretary General for peace and our support for all UN agencies in that regard. So thank you, Madam President, and I'd like to thank France for having requested this emergency meeting so that the Council can consider the worsening situation in Lebanon and Israel, recent developments that have placed the Middle East in an extremely vulnerable situation. Thank you, Secretary General, for the sobering information that you have provided us with and your call to the international community to mobilize the more than $400 million in humanitarian assistance that Lebanon requires at this time, and above all, for your permanent commitment to a de-escalation of the conflict and a ceasefire. We should begin by recalling that We are just 5 days away from the anniversary of the terrorist attacks by Hamas, which have no justification and must be condemned, that gave rise to the current spiral of violence that we're seeing in the region. The Palestinian cause cannot be used by Hezbollah and other extremist groups to try to, in vain, explain their acts of terrorism, such as the killing of children while they were playing football in Mahd al-Shams last July. Ecuador recognizes the imminent right to self-defense of member states of the United Nations in case of an armed attack in terms outlined in Article 51 of the Charter. We must put an end to the escalation of violence that has been described, which includes air bombings and incursions, the launching of rockets, ballistic missiles, acts of terrorism that continue to expose innocent civilians to loss of life and limb. In Gaza, we've seen tens of thousands of civilian deaths, including women and children. The states involved, international humanitarian law must be respected. Humanitarian workers must be able to fulfill their work and their lives must be respected. The states involved and regional organizations and the international community as a whole must deploy all diplomatic and political strategies possible to bring about a cessation of hostilities. This responsibility is greater for those that have a greater degree of influence over the parties to the conflict. Now is the time to take specific decisions aimed at achieving agreements that will lead to a lasting and sustainable peace. Resolutions 1701, 1559, 2722 and 2735 of the Security Council must be complied with without delay, since non-compliance constitutes a violation of international law. We must avoid another humanitarian disaster, leaving those who desire more violence without any excuse. Madam President, colleagues, Ortega and Gasset said, "It is false to say that in life circumstances decide. On the contrary, circumstances are the dilemma in the face of which we must make decisions. Who takes the decision is our character. Neither our collective responsibility in the Council nor peace, which constitutes a high value of humanity, can be subordinated to geopolitical tensions and interests. In conclusion, I reiterate that Ecuador supports all initiatives which have as their goal the restoration of peace and the sustainability of that peace." Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Switzerland. I would like to thank the Secretary General for his statement. Switzerland is extremely concerned about the recent developments in the Middle East. The risk of a regional war that we have been warning of for almost a year now is about to become a reality. In view of the countless civilian lives at risk, it is imperative that all actors in the region immediately cease hostilities to allow for de-escalation and that the Council fully plays its role. The intensification of hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah, including reports of Israeli ground incursions and the firing of some 200 ballistic missiles by Iran into Israeli territory, are unacceptable. The same applies to the offensives carried out by the Houthis and other armed groups in the region. All these attacks must stop immediately. Switzerland condemns this spiral of violence in the recent weeks. It is endangering the lives of civilians throughout the region. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed, including countless children. Several million have been forcibly displaced because of the hostilities. The civilian population is paying a heavy price for this military escalation in Lebanon, throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, and in Israel. Dialogue is the only way to avoid a regional war. Switzerland supports all efforts to find diplomatic solutions leading to an immediate end to the violence throughout the region. All parties, and those who have influence over them, must now show maximum restraint. Switzerland calls on all parties to act within the limits imposed by international law, including the United Nations Charter. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in the region must be respected. In addition, the will of this Council is clear. All of its resolutions must be implemented. This applies to the resolutions demanding a ceasefire in Gaza and calling for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. It also applies to the resolutions on the maritime security in the Red Sea. Similarly, we once again urge a return to a cessation of hostilities on both sides of the Blue Line, as well as an immediate recommitment to the implementation of Resolution 1701. This resolution is recognized by one and all. It sets out a path for resolving the underlying causes of the conflict and enabling the population of Lebanon and Israel to live in peace and security. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties in all circumstances and irrespective of the lawfulness of the use of force. This includes strict compliance with the principles relating to the conduct of hostilities, such as a distinction between civilians and combatants, proportionality, and precaution. Switzerland condemns all violations of international law that have taken place in recent days, including yesterday's ballistic attacks by Iran on Israel. Switzerland also condemns all violations of international humanitarian law. We also condemn all violence against civilians, such as yesterday's act of terror in Jaffa and the increasing attacks by settlers in the West Bank. Secretary General, Switzerland reiterates its support for the UN's commitment and good offices in the region. This applies in particular to UNIFIL and UNSCOL. UNIFIL, to which Switzerland contributes through UNSO, is currently working in an extremely dangerous environment so as to reduce tensions and ensure liaison between the parties. Switzerland also reiterates its full support for the work of the Secretary General. In addition, the UN, in collaboration with other organizations, is currently providing humanitarian aid to all civilians in need. We reiterate our call for the protection of UN personnel, in particular humanitarian and peacekeeping personnel. There is an urgent need to put an end to the suffering of the civilian population and to re-establish dialogue in order to bring peace to the region. The responsibility of a Security Council, united in its action for peace, is clear. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative under Rule 37. And I invite Lebanon to take the floor.
Madam President, at the outset, I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also thank Slovenia for its presidency of the Council during September. I would also like to thank France for requesting to hold this emergency meeting. I would also thank the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his briefing and his calls. We express our solidarity with him and we support him and his efforts. Madam President, we gather today in your august council as the Middle East region is burning from all sides. Lebanon is not doing well. Gaza is not doing well, as military Israeli forces and rows of battle tanks and armored vehicles are all along the southern borders of Lebanon. The Israeli government and its cabinet have ratified the ground invasion of Lebanon, which has started last night. This follows 11 months of a barbaric aggression that spared no civilians, no eyewitnesses, no aid workers, no journalists, no children, no women, and no elderly. Since the 8th of October 2023, Israel has killed and injured thousands of people in a blatant violation of UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law, and all international norms and humanitarian principles. Therefore, what Israel is claiming that this is merely limited surgical military operations, this is untrue. The damages to civilians and the civilian infrastructure are immense. What took place in Ain ad-Dilb village demonstrates just that. An Israeli strike on the 29th of September targeted a residential building, causing a massacre and killing 71 victims, including dozens of women and children, all buried in a mass grave. This tragedy recalls previous Israeli massacres during its previous invasions and attacks on Lebanon, particularly the two Qana massacres of 1996 and 2006. Israel has reaffirmed time and again its utter disregard for international law, despite the calls from all members of the Security Council in general and Switzerland especially on Israel to abide by its obligations under international law. Madam President, words and complaints have lost their meaning. How many times have we come before this Council and warned of the catastrophic situation along the southern borders? How many times have we sounded the alarm that this war could become a regional war that includes many fronts? What is happening today, this unprecedented level of killing, displacement, and destruction, this can no longer be tolerated or ignored. The policy of putting our heads in the sand and facing a confrontation with Israel is no longer useful. The south and the southern suburb of Beirut are sleeping on the streets. Mothers are carrying their children, fleeing the horrors of the destructive strikes and missiles used against civilians. Israel has intensified its aggression and its crimes against Lebanon and its capital, Beirut. In one day alone, on the 23rd of September, Israel, through its aerial bombardments, killed 569 people, including 50 children and 94 women. They've also assassinated the Secretary General of Hezbollah, His Eminence, on the 27th of September. Across history, there was never consensus for a standard description for any military, political, or revolutionary individual. And history is rich with examples of these individuals. Your council here today is divided over a correct description. However, there is consensus among everyone that confronting an occupying force is resistance. Madam President, as we have said time and again, and as His Excellency the Prime Minister has said in his statement before this Council last week, and as the Foreign Minister of Lebanon has repeated once and again, the people of Lebanon and the government of Lebanon reject the war. They want the implementation of Resolution 1701 with all its provisions. They want to deploy the Lebanese army in the south along our ground borders with the support of UNIFIL. This is the only solution for this blind war and this barbaric aggression. We have expressed our willingness to strengthen the presence of the army in the south, and the government has announced that it has opened the door for the enlistment of 1,500 new soldiers to comply with the implementation of Resolution 1701. In this regard, I recall that Lebanon has agreed to the French-American initiative that Israel has also initially agreed to, but then rejected this initiative, even annihilated it with a wave of killing and destruction that has been unprecedented in scale and violence. We also reaffirmed the official position as stated by the Prime Minister yesterday. We remain committed to the call issued by the American and French presidents, supported by a number of friendly and sisterly countries. We pledge to implement all the points of the declaration, including an immediate ceasefire, to start to look into the implementation of Resolution 1701 fully. We welcome the call and we pledge to implement it immediately. And upon a ceasefire, we are prepared to deploy the Lebanese army to the area south of the Litani River so that it can carry out its function fully in coordination with UNIFIL in the south. Madam President, today we are moving further and further towards an open, unrestricted regional war. The solution is to go back to political solutions based on relevant resolutions of international legitimacy. This situation will not be resolved until of Resolution 1701. And if we only focus on imposing military solutions instead of diplomatic solutions. Furthermore, the situation in Palestine will not be resolved and will only escalate. And the waves of killing and destruction will continue unless resolutions of the United Nations are implemented, particularly resolutions 2735, 242, 338 on the establishment of the Palestinian state. The Security Council must shoulder its responsibility to prevent an implosion in the Middle East and to help us exit this dark tunnel. Madam President, Lebanon today is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Lebanon needs urgent humanitarian assistance. It is the only state that hosts 2 million Syrian IDPs, 500,000 Palestinian refugees, and we also have around 1 million Lebanese IDPs. This is an unusual precedent. We have warned before of the risk of displacement, and today we are before a humanitarian crisis with 1 million IDPs, with thousands of them on the streets without